For this mock exercise, we're going to take a look at period cost application, and we're going to use Wright and Brown to illustrate common cost. Common cost. So what are common costs? So common costs are cost of operating a facility or an activity or a like cost object that is shared by two or more users. That's what a common cost is. So let's say I'm buying a ticket to go to Calgary and Vancouver, and I need to visit two different divisions, Calgary and Vancouver, and I buy a round-trip ticket that takes me from Toronto to Calgary, Calgary to Vancouver, and then, of course, back to Toronto. That is what we call common cost, because this cost of the ticket is common to both the Calgary division and the Vancouver division. And the question is, how do I allocate that cost of ticket, the flight cost? How do I allocate that flight cost? Do I allocate it to Calgary because that was really the original, sorry, Vancouver because that was my original destination? I need to go to Vancouver, but I decide to to create a stop to Calgary to visit the Calgary division, or do I allocate those equally or proportionately? So let's take a look at the methodology. So in your textbook, there's actually two methods of allocating common cost. And these two methods are standalone, and the other one's called incremental. So in a standalone, we look at each cost object. So the trip to Calgary and the trip to Vancouver. And we're going to take a look at the individual cost. So in other words, how much would it cost me to take a flight from Toronto to Calgary and back? And I need to also look at the cost of taking the flight from Toronto to Vancouver and back, and look at the relative values, cost for each of those two flights. I'm going to use that to allocate and use the percentage to allocate the common cost. So that's essentially what a standalone is that we're going to use the relative individual standalone cost. So in other words, the cost from Toronto to Calgary and back, that's the relative standalone cost, and standalone cost from Toronto to Vancouver and back. We're going to take a look at the relative percentage and allocate that relative percentage to the common cost. That's called a standalone model. The other one is the incremental cost allocation method. And this one requires us to rank the individual users of the cost object in order of users most responsible for the common cost. So that's the key word, is which of these two users, which of my two trips was the main reason why I was going out west. So in my example, the fact that I'm going to Vancouver was my primary reason why I bought the ticket, and I decided to maybe do a stopover in Calgary to visit the Calgary office, means that the Vancouver is the primary user. So I would first rank the cost, the standalone cost is the value of that standalone cost is what I'm going to allocate first to Vancouver, and the difference between the standalone and the common cost goes to the secondary user, which is the Calgary office. So let's say if I paid $1,200 for the ticket, and to go to Vancouver cost $800, and to go to Calgary costs $600. So these are the standalone cost. Then under the standalone method, we're going to take a look at the relative values. So we're going to take 1,200 times 800 divided by 800 plus 600, And that's going to be the cost to the Vancouver trip, the Vancouver division. And for Calgary, we're going to actually take that same common cost, $1,200, and we're going to allocate based on the relative standalone values. Okay, so let's do the math. So this would be $686, and the difference would be $514. So that's how much it would cost. We're going to do standalone cost. Now, under the incremental method, we said that we're going to rank Vancouver as the primary. So the amount that we're going to charge Vancouver division is going to be $800, and Calgary is going to be charged, because they're the primary, and Calgary is going to be charged the difference between $1,200 and $800, which is $400. And that's the incremental cost allocation method. We have to select which of these two is the primary user. So let's take a look at this question. So Wrights and Brown are two small clothing companies that are considering leasing a dyeing machine together. The company estimated in order to meet the production, Wright needs the machine 900 hours. So let's put that as W. And Brown needs it for 600 hours. If each company rents the machine on its own, the fee is $40 per usage. If they rent the machine together, the fee is $32 for usage. The first part of the question is calculate Wrights and Brown's respective share of fees under the standalone cost allocation. So that's the first method, standalone. The second method says, what if we use the incremental method? And of course, the third part is, which method would you recommend? So let's look at the first part. So standalone, we need to determine the value, okay, of each of these two companies. So if they were to rent the dyeing machine on their own, how much would they pay? So Wrights, let's call it W, okay, they would need 900 hours, and they would rent it for $40 divided by the relative value of each standalone. So this would be W's, and Brown's is 600 times 40. Now we're going to use the relative ratios. So it's going to be similar for Brown, right? So let's just do that. So this is 36,000. This is 36,000. And this one, 40 times 600 times 40 is 24,000. Okay, so let me just show you what the sum of this formula, so that we're aware. Okay, now we're going to multiply this times the price for renting the machine together, and they need 1,500 hours, and that's from 9 plus 6, that's 1,500 hours at $32. And this is 48,000. Let me write that down. That's the sum of that. So that means that for W, it's going to be 36,000 divided by 36 plus 24 times 48,000 to give us 28,800. For brown, we're going to do the same thing, right? Except it's 2,400 divided by 36,000 plus 24,000 times 48,000 gives us 19,200. The sum of these two obviously adds to the 48,000. Now, part 2 says, what if we use the incremental cost allocation method but we're going to actually say that right is the primary user. So W is the primary user. So if the W is the primary user, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, how much is it costing us altogether? It's costing us 48,000. Okay. If W is the primary user, I'm going to allocate first to W the fair value of the service if they do it themselves, which in that case it would be the 900 times the $40. So that's the 36,000. And that means that Brown gets the remaining difference, which is 12,000. Now, if Brown is the primary user, so let me just highlight these as a separate. So I just want to make sure that this is for this one, right? And now I'm saying, what if B is the primary user? Just wanted to show you what the impact would be. So total cost is 48. We're going to allocate B because B is the primary user. In that case, it would be 24,000. No, 24,000, yes. And that would be 600 times $40. And the difference goes to W. And that would be the difference in this case. Now, let's do a chart and compare the three methods. So let's go with W and B. If we did a standalone, the allocation would be 28,800 and 19,200. If we did incremental, but W is the primary user, 36,000 and 12,000. And if we did incremental, Brown's the primary user, you get 24,000 and 24,000. Now, part B says, which method would you recommend? And Wright and Brown recommend that Wright and Brown to use to share the fees. So which one do you think we should recommend? Well, the allocation method is very sensitive, right? Because if we did a standalone, then you could see that this method is fair and much more simple. And it's essentially easy to explain, isn't it? Easy to explain. Definitely easier to explain to both Wright and Brown that this is the total cost is the shared cost at the lower cost, and then your relative fair value of your use would be how we're going to allocate this. Now, this is going to create discrepancy, because how do we then choose which is the primary, W, Wright, or Brown? And there's going to be a bit of a dispute who's the primary party, because obviously if you're the primary party, you get allocated the most cost. So in this case of W, they get allocated the most cost. With Brown being the primary, but you see, you got to understand, Brown only used 600 hours as opposed to 900 hours of Wright. So they get to share the fees equally. So that's not going to bode well either with Brown. So these two will create disputes. And really, it's going to be hard to explain which one we should go with. So that's why it's standalone, to me, is far more superior. Now, in my example earlier, when I said if I was going to Vancouver and I was actually going there, that was my primary destination, I just happened to create a short stop to visit the Calgary office, then it's much easier and much better to defend this allocation, because clearly the primary is me going to Vancouver. In other words, Calgary was not the main reason why I was going out west. But if I was actually taking the trip and I was actually creating two trips, and I decided to put the two trips together, then visiting Calgary is as important as visiting the Vancouver office, and therefore the standalone allocation may be the better method to defend, better method to explain to both the Vancouver operation and the Calgary operation to why I'm charging the flight cost accordingly. Okay? So there's no magical rule of thumb to say which method is much more superior. It depends on essentially the main reason why, or the main attraction for the common cost. But clearly the standalone is much more fair, much more simple, and easy to explain. Thank you.